After the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln on the night of April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth went on the run with his accomplice, David Herold, for 12 days. What ensued was the largest manhunt in United States history. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and his War Department advertised a $100,000 reward for the capture of Booth and his alleged conspirators at the time. $50,000 for Booth and $25,000 each for John Surratt and David Herold. In total, this would be equal to several $million in 21st century America. While Booth's eventual fate of being killed at Garrett's farm is well known, his day-to-day movements during the manhunt are less so. Today here on the Mr. Drosty History Channel, we will examine the actions of Booth and Herold as they evaded the authorities for nearly 2 weeks. Following the shooting of President Lincoln at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865, Booth made his escape out the back door of the theater. There, a horse was being held for him by Joseph Peanuts Burroughs. Booth had originally asked stagehand Edmund Spangler to hold the horse, but Spangler passed the duty on to Burroughs. Spangler would later be charged as a conspirator in the assassination and was the only person accused who was found not guilty of that charge. Even so, he was charged with assisting Booth and sentenced to 6 years of hard labor. Booth then rode the horse to escape the scene at the theater via Baptist Alley, then down Pennsylvania Avenue and 11th Street to the Navy Yard Bridge, where he arrived sometime after 10:30 p.m. Nobody was supposed to be allowed to cross the bridge after 9 o'clock p.m., but he was allowed to cross as word of the assassination had not reached the guards at the bridge. When asked why he didn't cross earlier, Booth told the guards that he was waiting for the moon to rise so that he could have the light of the moon to ride by. They allowed him to cross, but said he would not be allowed back across the bridge into D.C. until daybreak, which of course was fine with Booth. Booth then met up with David Herold on the Maryland side of the river. Both men then headed to the Surratt Tavern in Surrattsville, Maryland, which is today Clinton, Maryland. The duo arrived around midnight. By this point, Booth was famously suffering from a broken leg. The broken leg had been suffered either from the jump he made to the stage at Ford's or in a horse riding accident during his escape. He waited on his horse at the tavern while Herold knocked loudly on the door. John M. Lloyd, the tavern keeper who was renting the property from Mary Surratt, woke up and was told by Herold to make haste and get those things. This was not exactly a surprise to Lloyd, as Mary Surratt had visited him earlier in the day and told him a party would be arriving and he should supply them with 2 rifles and a set of field glasses that had been hidden at the tavern. While Lloyd went to get the items, Herold entered the tavern and took some whiskey for he and Booth. Booth refused to take the second rifle as he believed it would be too hard to carry due to his broken leg. Booth then informed Lloyd that "we have assassinated the president and Secretary Seward." Booth and Herold then rode away from the tavern and arrived at Dr. Samuel A. Mudd's home around 4 o'clock a.m. on April 15. Dr. Mudd was awakened by a knock at his door, and despite Mudd's later claims that he did not recognize the man at his door as Booth, this claim is highly suspect. Mudd was quite familiar with Booth by April 1865. He had previously introduced Booth to John Surratt, and Booth even spent a night at the Mudd farm on the night of December 18, 1864. Early that morning on April 15th, Mudd and Herold helped Booth to the sofa inside where the doctor examined the broken leg. Booth was then taken upstairs and laid down on a bed so that Dr. Mudd could set and splint his broken leg. Mudd had to cut off Booth's riding boot in order to fashion the splint around his leg. Booth then rested alone throughout the morning and lay upstairs. Herold asked Dr. Mudd about obtaining a wagon that he could use to transport Booth. At one point, Herold and Dr. Mudd traveled to the nearby home of Dr. Mudd's father to try to obtain a wagon, but there was none to be found. The two then traveled to Bryantown, where Dr. Mudd would shop for his wife and Herold would look for a wagon. However, on the outskirts of town, federal troops were spotted. Herold got back to the Mudd farm as fast as possible, while Dr. Mudd continued in Bryantown to shop for his wife. Mudd would later claim that it was while he was in Bryantown that he first heard of Lincoln's assassination. When he returned home to his farm that day, Mudd later testified that Booth and Herold were on their horses and departing from his farm. In the next few hours, Booth and Herold crossed the Zacchaeus Swamp with the paid help of a guide named Oswald Swan, who was a free black man. They paid Swan $12 for guiding them through the swamp and to Rich Hill, the home of Colonel Samuel Cox, a Confederate sympathizer. They arrived in the early morning hours of Easter Sunday, April 16th. Cox immediately observed the condition of Booth's broken leg and ordered Franklin Roby, his overseer, to help hide Booth and Herold in a nearby pine thicket before sunrise. The pair would hide there in the woods for the next 4.5 days. Cox contacted his foster brother, Thomas Jones, a Confederate agent, about helping the pair cross the Potomac River into Virginia. Jones met Booth and Herold in the pine thicket and told them he would bring them supplies as they waited for a safe time to cross the river. Booth and Herold stayed there for the next 4 nights until Thursday, April 20th. Jones brought the men food and newspapers as they hid. While they were here, Booth and Herold killed their horses, which made too much noise and couldn't be fed. They took the horses into the swamp and shot and killed them. Booth kept a journal where he wrote his thoughts on what had transpired so far. The first entry is titled April 14th, Friday. Booth had clearly read the papers and what they had said about the assassination, and he attempts to craft his own narrative here in a theatrical way that only John Wilkes Booth could. John Wilkes Booth wrote in his journal, "Until today, nothing was ever thought of sacrificing to our country's wrongs. For 6 months, we had worked to capture, but our course being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done. But its failure was owing to others who did not strike for their country with a heart. I struck boldly, and not as the papers say. I walked with a firm step through 1,000 of his friends, was stopped, but pushed on. A colonel was at his side. I shouted 'Sic Semper' before I fired. In jumping, broke my leg. I passed all his pickets, rode 60 miles that night with the bone of my leg tearing the flesh at every jump. I can never repent it, though we hated to kill. Our country owed all her troubles to him, and God simply made me the instrument of his punishment. The country is not what it was. This forced union is not what I have loved. I care not what becomes of me. I have no desire to outlive my country. This night, I wrote a long article in which, and left it for one of the editors of the National Intelligencer, in which I fully set forth our reasons for our proceedings, he or the government." On Thursday, April 20th, Thomas Jones returned and told the men that federal authorities were concentrating on St. Mary's County to their south. He told Herold and Booth to prepare to cross the Potomac into Virginia that night. As night fell, they left the thicket, stopped at Jones' home very briefly, and then found a 12-foot fishing boat that was hidden on the banks of the Potomac River. Specifically, it was located in a small stream located in Dent's Meadow. Booth paid Jones for the boat. The conspirators were given oars, a compass, and a candle as Jones pushed them off into the river. It was a foggy night with a light wind, and it didn't take long for Booth and Herold to veer off course as the men paddled into the darkness and became lost. They made landfall, but when the sun came up the next morning, they found themselves still in Maryland, roughly 9 miles upriver from where they pushed off the night before. Herold recognized the area they were in from past hunting trips. They were at a place called Indiantown Farm, which was leased by a man named John J. Hughes, a friend of Herold's. Hughes let the men rest in a small former slave cabin and gave them food. The conspirators spent almost 48 hours here. The evening of April 21st, Booth wrote his second entry in his journal. Friday the 21st. After being hunted like a dog through swamps, woods, and last night being chased by gunboats till I was forced to return wet, cold, and starving, with every man's hand against me, I am here in despair. And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for, what made Tell a hero, and yet I for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew. I'm looked upon as a common cutthroat. My actions was purer than either of theirs. One hoped to be great himself. The other had not only his country's, but his own wrongs to avenge. I hoped for no gain. I knew no private wrong. I struck for my country and that alone, a country that groaned beneath his tyranny and prayed for this end, and yet now behold the cold hand they extend to me. God cannot pardon me if I have done wrong, yet I cannot see my wrong except in serving a degenerate people. The very little I left behind to clear my name, the government will not allow to be printed. So ends all. For my country I have given up all that makes life sweet and holy, brought misery upon my family, and am sure there is no pardon in the heaven for me, since man condemns me so. I have only heard of what has been done, except what I did myself, and it fills me with horror. God try and forgive me and bless my mother. Tonight I will once more try the river with the intent to cross. Though I have a greater desire and almost a mind to return to Washington, and in a measure clear my name, which I feel I can do, I do not repent the blow I struck. I may before my God, but not to man, I think have done well, though I am abandoned with the curse of Cain upon me. When if the world knew my heart, that one blow would have made me great. Though I did desire no greatness, tonight I try to escape these bloodhounds once more. Who can read his fate? God's will be done. I have too great a soul to die like a criminal. Oh, may he spare me that and let me die bravely. I bless the entire world, have never hated or wronged anyone. This last was not a wrong, unless God deems it so, and it's with him to damn or bless me. And for this brave boy with me who often prays, yes, before and since, with a true and sincere heart, was it crime in him? If so, why can he pray the same? I do not wish to shed a drop of blood, but I must fight the course. 'Tis all that's left me. This would be the final journal entry that Booth would write. The night of Saturday, April 22nd, into the early morning hours of Sunday, April 23rd, Booth and Herold again tried to cross the Potomac River by boat. This time, they reached the Virginia side and landed at the mouth of Gambo Creek. This was not where they intended to land, though. They were one stream north of Mackinac Creek, which was their intended landing site. Due to his broken leg, Booth waited with the men's boat on April 23rd, while Herold walked about 1 mile to Mrs. Cusenberry's cottage for assistance. She was someone who was involved with smuggling Confederate mail. When Herold got to her home, she wasn't there, so he made small talk with Cusenberry's daughter. When she returned, Mrs. Cusenberry was nervous about helping the conspirators. She ended up sending a meal with Herold and reached out to Thomas Harbin and Joseph Baden, 2 Confederate agents, to help them. They spoke to Booth and were also nervous about being around him. They ended up passing him off to a local farmer named William Bryant, directing the farmer to get the conspirators to a local doctor named Richard Stewart to help with Booth's leg. Booth and Herold ended up at Dr. Stewart's home, a place called Clydale. Believe it or not, Dr. Stewart is related through marriage to Robert E. Lee. Stewart's wife was Robert E. Lee's cousin, and Lee's daughter had even spent about a month living on the property at the start of the Civil War. But Dr. Stewart wanted nothing to do with Herold and Booth. He refused to medically help Booth no matter how much he pled. He did eventually give the men a meal, but he refused to let them stay at his home. He told them to try the Lucas family cabin across the field. The Lucas family was a free black family. Booth was angry about the lack of help that he was getting in Virginia. Booth took out his knife, and he forced William Lucas and the rest of his family out of their home. Booth and Herold slept in the cabin that night, April 23rd, while the Lucas family slept outside of the cabin. Booth wrote an angry note to Dr. Stewart that night. On the morning of Monday, April 24th, Booth hired the oldest Lucas son, Charlie Lucas, to take them by wagon south to the Rappahannock River. It is possible that they stopped in the small town of Office Hall, Virginia for breakfast along the way. They eventually made it to the river around noon on April 24th on the north side of the river in the small town of Port Conway. They waited for a ferry which would take them across the river to Port Royal. As they were waiting, 3 Confederate soldiers would ride up. Herold identified himself and Booth, and the soldier agreed to help them. So the 5 men crossed on the ferry to Port Royal around 2:00 p.m. One of the soldiers, Willie Jett, looked for a home in Port Royal for Booth and Herold to rest at. Willie Jett asked Sarah Jane Peyton if she would let a wounded Confederate soldier recover at her home. She agreed. They eventually arrived at the Peyton house, and Sarah Jane Peyton was there at her brother's home. And at first she agreed to help Booth. However, she changed her mind since her brother wasn't home, and she suggested that the men go 2 miles down the road to Richard Henry Garrett's farm. The men rode south, and they arrived at Garrett's farm at about 4:00 p.m. on April 24th. Booth was dropped off at the farm, and the family was told that Booth was a wounded Confederate soldier named Boyd. They welcomed him into the house, while Herold and the rest of the soldiers rode south to Bowling Green, Virginia. This would be the only time while on the run that Herold and Booth spent a night apart. Booth slept in the Garrett's home that night, while Herold stayed with the Confederate soldiers in Bowling Green. Herold returned to Garrett's farm on Tuesday, April 25th. Booth told the family that Herold was his cousin. That day, a detachment of Union soldiers rode by the farm, and Herold and Booth panicked, running into the woods. This caused the Garretts to become suspicious. The two men explained their actions by saying they had a run-in with the soldiers previously over an accusation of stolen horses, but the family wasn't buying it. So the night of April 25th, the Garretts instructed the men to sleep in the tobacco barn. They worried that Booth and Herold would steal their horses, so they actually locked them in the barn. Two of the Garrett boys slept in a corn crib between the barn and the stables that night to keep watch. At about 2:00 a.m. that night, the early morning of Wednesday, April 26th, a detachment of the 26th New York Cavalry arrived at the farm. They surrounded the barn, and Herold gave himself up, but Booth refused. The soldiers lit the barn on fire. Booth started hobbling towards the door with a Spencer carbine in one hand and a revolver in the other. As he prepared to fire, Sergeant Boston Corbett fired a pistol between two slats in the barn and wounded Booth in the neck. Booth collapsed. He was paralyzed. Booth was taken to the Garrett's front porch, where he died at approximately 7:00 a.m. Booth's final words came as he looked at his paralyzed hands, and he uttered the words, "Useless, useless."